All right, so the CEO of Grayscale, Michael Sonnenshein, I hope I pronounced the name right, was on CNBC, and he basically highlighted that the ETF, he made a good point. He said, I'm not into price predictions, and as a CEO of a big Bitcoin ETF filer, he shouldn't be a price predictor. But what he went on to say was that as a result of the ETF, the the potential capital that will have the ability to now invest in the ETF is $30 trillion of advised capital. What does that mean? That means that $30 trillion of capital is currently under advisement. That means somebody has taken their money, right, $30 trillion of it, and told other people, hey, invest this for me and make sure I don't go poor. So there's $30 trillion of that capital in the United States at this point. And Michael went on to say that, the ETF would unlock $30 trillion of capital to be able to be invested in Bitcoin. And of course, something that a lot of people have got mistaken about this is that they went off and thought, okay, so $30 trillion is going to come into Bitcoin, multiply that by 108, the bull market multiplier, etc., 118, the bull market multiplier, and this means XYZ. It doesn't mean that. Let me break down exactly what this means. The ETF is the absolute first time in Bitcoin's history that capital that is that is being advised, i.e., I am managing your money, right? If this is the first time in history of Bitcoin that capital by any significant advisor of capital can be invested in Bitcoin, because there simply has not been another vehicle with regulatory clarity that they could invest in. This is the absolute first time in history that they can actually put that capital to work in Bitcoin. And so what he was trying to say is that there is a fresh new batch of potential $30 trillion of capital that can choose to make an allocation to Bitcoin as a result of the ETF, right? And again, this is a phenomenal amount of capital. Bitcoin's never seen anything like this. If anything, there was maybe 20 to 25 to maybe $30 billion that actually went into Bitcoin in the last bull run, and it took the price from 3.5K at the bottom to 69K at the top. We're talking about a $30 trillion of potential capital that could go into Bitcoin. Now, what he actually, and again, nobody is front running this at this point. I'm going to do a video this week, which is why I want you to subscribe to the channel, about why nobody is front running the Bitcoin ETF. Nobody is front running this Bitcoin ETF, and there's regulatory reasons around that, and I'm going to cover all of that in a future video. So please subscribe to the channel. It's very, very important that we get this information out there, because it's the first time for retail to actually front run the institution, simply because there is regulatory restrictions that are in place. That means that Wall Street's basically held outside of this. This capital, this $30 trillion in managed and advised capital, is held out of this until the ETF comes out. So please subscribe to the channel and help me spank the YouTube algorithm to get Bitcoin content out in front of more people, more normal people, as fast as possible. So, what he actually meant is that there is a pool of $30 trillion of advised capital in the United States that will be able to invest in Bitcoin. So what does this mean for Bitcoin's potential price rise? What I think is that you'll probably get 0.5 to 5% of that capital actually find its way into Bitcoin over the first 5 to 10 years of the asset. Remember, when gold got its ETF in 2004, it went on an 8-year tear until the asset was saturated. And so it went from $350 an ounce to $2,000 an ounce until the asset was fully saturated, and then obviously it's done absolutely nothing since then. It can't even break 2100 solidly, right? It breaks 2100 and then has a heart attack and collapses. It's an impotent asset at this point. So out of that $30 trillion of advised capital that he's talking about, he's not talking about $30 trillion of inflow. He's saying that $30 trillion of potential capital to come in And I think, and everyone can think differently, that that 0.5 to 5% of an allocation of that $30 trillion into Bitcoin over the next 5 to 10 years is a reasonable, conservative amount, especially because, remember, it's not like any other asset. They're going to have every single one of their sales team, every single one of their advisors for the top advising firms on the planet calling all of their clients saying, hey, you should get an allocation, you should get an allocation, you should get an allocation. So I think 0.5 to 5% is reasonable of that capital. So what does that mean? That means there's somewhere between 150 billion to 1.5 trillion dollars of capital that's going to be actually flowing into Bitcoin. And of course, as you know, as I've tried to tell everyone this since the summer, and I'm glad more people are now talking about this as a result of my videos because I think it's extremely important. There is a multiplier effect, right? There is a multiplier effect. $1 into Bitcoin doesn't equal $1 of an increase in market cap. There is this market cap multiplier effect, and I've done many videos about this. And so please go find them if you don't have never heard of that. But based on the Bank of America bull market multiplier, basically $150 billion in to $1.5 trillion in implies a market cap increase of $17.7 trillion to $177 trillion. So what does that mean on a per Bitcoin basis? What that means is on a per Bitcoin basis, you're looking at a price increase of $843,000 to $8.4 million of an increase. That sounds great, right? That sounds great, except it gets terrifying when you realize that he didn't even include all of the managed assets, all of the advised capital outside of the borders of the United States of America, all of the advised capital hiding in those British-controlled islands where you have legal tax avoidance, but you still have managed capital. He didn't include retail demand. He didn't include institutional or corporate demand based on the FASB rule changes. He didn't include central bank demand. He didn't include banking demand, because if banks can now hold your Bitcoin and lend out against it and it becomes a treasury asset for the bank, that you don't think they're going to be advertising. He didn't include real estate capital moving. He didn't include any of this. He's talking about $30 trillion of advised capital that's probably sitting in bonds and equities, moving, having the ability for the first time ever to invest in the highest performing asset that humanity has ever seen. He didn't include any of these other things, right? He didn't include the $150 trillion of capital that's actually managed by the top 500 asset managers in the world. He's talking about $30 trillion of managed capital in the United States of America alone. But what have we been talking about over the last few months? I've been telling you that as soon as the US market opens up, all these other markets have like this subliminal permission to not get fired, to not take any risk, because the US is doing this. So therefore, I can invest in a US fund. He didn't talk about any of that. Everyone's losing their minds over his point, and his point is amazing. $30 trillion for the first time ever has an opportunity to invest in Bitcoin. But what about the other $120 trillion that's managed by the top 500 asset managers in the world? He didn't mention any of that. So his point is extremely bullish, and I commend him because he's being a responsible CEO, right? He's giving you a bullish piece of news, but he's also holding it back, because that's what you should do as a responsible CEO. All of these companies, I think Michael has navigated, GBTC extremely well through this period, and I think they've done an extremely good job at figuring out how to get this ETF approved, and they've played this strategically extremely well to put the SEC into a corner where the SEC has no choice now. Gary Gensler's basically on TV saying, hey, this is a translation of what Gary Gensler said, hey, we got our asses kicked by the court, so we're reevaluating it based on not wanting to get our asses kicked again, right? So, he's doing a fantastic job at explaining how much capital is out there, but he's not even touching the tip of the iceberg. Do you know how much American capital is sitting in offshore tax havens? completely legally, by the way. This is nothing to do with this is illegal. It's completely legal to have capital sitting in tax havens that can be invested back into the American markets. You can't mention that as American managed wealth, right? That would be offshore managed wealth. So he's not even talking about the amount of offshore wealth, which quadruples what he's saying at this point. So there is a phenomenal amount of capital, a truly terrifying amount of capital that is about to get access to the single most best performing asset humanity has ever seen. And on top of that, the hardest, most secure asset we've ever created. You don't think they're going to take a slice? This is why I'm trying to say time is running out. And now we're at the 18th of December. We're less than 3 weeks away from when the Bloomberg intelligence guys, Eric and James, are giving us a 90% probability that the ETF is going to be approved and all of this capital influx starts. And people are still sitting around fucking wasting time trying to argue about DCA, lump sum, this, that, and the other, rather than getting to one Bitcoin, which has been the mission that I've been on, trying to explain to people on YouTube. You need to get to one Bitcoin. That is the single most important thing. Stop high-fiving happy hippies. Stop worrying about the $10 a month DCA gang. Stop worrying about the $1,000 net worth as opinions. Get to one Bitcoin and then waste your time. Because this capital is coming. And they're not coming to be nice. They're coming to take everything. So you gotta realize, like, either you're gonna wake up to this or you're not, and which is why one of the videos I'm gonna release this week, which is why I want you to subscribe, around the fact that nobody's front running this. You got open game here, and people are not taking that advantage. That video is extremely important, which is why I want you to subscribe to the channel, because ultimately, despite all of this, despite how much capital is coming in or anything like that, there are still only 3 rules to Bitcoin. Step number 1, you buy Bitcoin. Step number 2, shut the fuck up. And step number 3, you get fabulously wealthy.